Good afternoon and welcome to today's structured conversation. My name is Nicole Long and I will serve as your moderator today. On behalf of the SAL Professional Development Committee, I thank you for participating in today's structured conversation, and an extra thank you to today's guest speakers. A few logistics before we get started. You must have a YouTube account and channel to participate in the chat dialog box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you do not have a channel, there is a link to create one. I encourage you to participate in today's discussion by asking questions, sharing comments, and providing feedback through chatting. We would also like you to be aware there is a delay between our conferencing technology and YouTube broadcast. Please bear with us if we take a few moments to respond. We will get to your questions and comments. So if you want to go ahead and look in the live chat box right now, you'll see instructions that I've typed in to help you with creating a YouTube channel so that you can access the chat feature. Okay, so let's get started with today's conversation. Our title today is Data Storytelling Using Design Thinking Models. Our presenters today are Leslie D'Souza and Julia Smead. A little bit about our presenters. Leslie is a student affairs assessment professional that specializes in storytelling with data. Currently, she is the manager of communications and assessment in the Office of Student Life at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. She worked on creating the design thinking inspired model of practice she uses to inform her work during her time as the manager of student affairs storytelling at Ryerson University. She is involved in the Canadian Association of College and University Student Services as the co-chair for the Research, Assessment, and Evaluation Community of Practice, is a member of the ACPA Commission for Assessment and Evaluation Directorate, and part of the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders Advancement Committee. She completed her Master of Arts in College Student Personnel from Bowling Green State University in 2006 and is a mom to 2 little boys. Julia is a leader, innovator, and entrepreneur who specializes in design thinking, community collaboration, and related methodologies that strive to design with students rather than for them. Currently, she is the leader of the Innovation Hub at the University of Toronto, where she works with teams of over 150 students and staff on campus to improve the community's campus experience. The Innovation Hub conducts empathy-based interviews with students to generate stories that serve as inspiration for program, service, and resource design at the University of Toronto. Julia holds an MBA from the University of Fredericton in Global Leadership and a bachelor's degree in psychology from Western University. She is the secretary of the Council of Student Services at the University of Toronto and has presented at various conferences, including the Canadian Association of College and University Student Services and the Canadian Association of Career Educators and Employers. Outside of her work, Julia is a mom to 4-year-old twins, Joshua and Victoria, who just started junior kindergarten. So as a result of this structured conversation, participants will be able to articulate the 3 elements of data storytelling and how they work together to create compelling stories, discuss the relationship between storytelling and empathy, and describe one new method of storytelling that they might employ to increase the impact of their data. So let's go ahead and get started.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Nicole. So like Nicole said, I'm Leslie, and we talked about putting together this presentation, and the most logical place we thought to start was to talk a little bit about what stories are. Before we can get into data storytelling, we really have to understand why stories are a powerful way for us to learn. And the key to that is that stories are how we build empathy. And it's really important to acknowledge too is I think storytelling is a bit of a buzzword that's out there right now, as though it's something new. And in fact, it's the oldest thing that people do. It's the oldest way that we learn. And I think it's amazing for us to be able to connect with our Indigenous colleagues to understand more about Indigenous pedagogy and methodology, because storytelling is built in so well into everything they do in terms of learning. And that's something that we're relearning right now in assessment professional settings. So stories are how we build empathy, and there's scientific backing to this. If you read anything about the neuroscience of learning, if you read about the limbic system, or even if you start to learn more about Simon Sinek and his golden circle and using why as a motivation, you'll start to see that empathy and emotions are key to motivating people. And the way that we build those emotions and that empathic connection is through stories. So Simon Sinek says, if you hire people just because they can do a job, they'll work for your money. But if you hire people who believe what you believe, they'll work for you with blood, sweat, and tears. And it's true. And it really speaks, I think, to how storytelling and empathy underpin culture. So we can move on to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit more about that.
Oh, yeah, and I'll just add, Leslie, I think just that stories can be so powerful that so often we look at quantitative data and it tells us a part of a story, or we might feel encouraged or concerned, but that the human element from stories can be so powerful in terms of helping people see how that data can come to life. And so we'll share some examples a little bit later, but I just want to add.
For sure. Sorry about that. So talking a little bit more about storytelling and empathy and culture and the interaction between those things, a lot of the times we think that stories are shaped by people, but in many cases it's the other way around. We're actually shaped by the stories that we consume. And that forms the basis for the culture that we believe we're a part of. And so when you're part of a similar culture with other people, you have a set of shared stories about what you believe in and where you are. And so when we talk about storytelling and assessment, I think those are both change management tools that we need to understand so that we can create the cultural setting that we need to build the right solutions. So how many of us have tried to build a great solution that didn't work because we didn't appreciate maybe some of the cultural context that we were in that acted as a barrier to that taking off? So it can't be the right solution unless we understand the culture. And if we're trying to shift culture into positive directions so that we can build better solutions for everyone, we need to understand how we can use stories to help us do that. Because again, storytelling really does feed the empathy of everyone around who's hearing the story. And then that shared story can become a touchstone in the culture that will feed new editions of stories that reinforce that culture.
Absolutely.
So yeah, the biggest issue I think with building stories as a basis for culture is that we have to make sure they're true stories. I think we've all seen the examples of false stories and how powerful they can be in shifting culture in directions that maybe aren't great. So we need to be ethical and use good data to form the backbone of truth. At the center of every compelling story is truth. And in our organizations, we have to find our truth in data. And it needs to be good data if we want to be able to move forward intentionally in positive ways. And then once we've done that, those solutions that we're looking for will come a lot more easily once we've created that readiness in the culture.
Yeah, and we really saw this in our work in the Innovation Hub of some of the ways in which this can be really challenging. And one of the things we learned right away was that we tend to, I think each have this tendency to really fall in love with our own ideas and have a hard time kind of expanding outside of what we think is best. As part of the Innovation Hub, we conducted over 130 interviews with students, and these interviews were in-depth. They lasted, they were open-ended, empathy-based, and lasted anywhere from 45 to 90 minutes each. And so we had a lot of quantitative data and themes started to emerge. But what we saw culturally was really interesting, because as we started to ideate around this data, we found that the staff involved in that process would tend to kind of move quickly away from the data and back into kind of their own ideas and their own thoughts about what was best. And so it's really taken some time to start to shift the culture and keep bringing it back to the stories and keep bringing it back to those insights. And that can be really tricky for people to do, including myself, and I found that in the process too. So culture change does take time, but I think stories are part of what will help us with that.
Mm-hmm. And it can feel like you're doing nothing when you're doing the really hard work of trying to shift culture. It feels like you're spinning your tires and that there's not a lot happening. And then all of a sudden, when you've completed that shift in culture, you've helped people shift their internal story, which is the hardest one to change. It's easy to tell stories outwardly. The hardest thing is to get people to adopt those as their own stories. And that's when you've achieved culture shift. And once that happens, all of a sudden you'll see changes really fast. You'll start to see a whole bunch of things happening all at once. So don't ever think that it's not important work or that it's not going well, because it does take a lot of time and a lot of relationship building and investment in shifting people's internal monologues. So we'll move on and talk a little bit more about context around stories, because that's really what stories are all about. So when we talk about context, when I first got my job at Ryerson as the manager of student affairs storytelling, I had a funny moment where I had to call my mom and tell her I got this new job, and I told her my job title. And so my mother, the context here is that my mother is a teacher librarian. And when I told her I'm the manager of student affairs storytelling, she was really excited, but really confused about what I was doing, because again, for her and her culture, she was coming from a place where stories were things that were read to children from library books. So it was an interesting conversation, an interesting understanding I had to have with her to bring her to a new place, to know a little bit more about what I was doing. And context is everything. It's everything around what happens in the story. It's the setting, it's the characters, it's all of the pieces that play into why what's happening is challenging and why what's happening is important. And the other piece of context that's really important to the story is the storyteller. And I think that this is one of the keys to why maybe we have devalued storytelling in academia, because we have removed ourselves from data. We have considered data as there is examples of perfectly objective data out there that we can separate from humans. And the fact is that all knowledge is relational. Every piece of data has passed through the hands of a human and has been contextualized by that human, who made choices about what kind of analysis to do, what kind of data points to collect, what kind of stories to share. And once we understand that, then we can understand how important the storyteller is to the story and really build on that. So the storyteller is not only important to contextualize, but their emotional connection to the story is actually what's going to make it relatable to other people. So you have to have somebody telling the story who cares about the story. And so that means taking a hard look at sometimes who is the person who is sharing the stories that we want shared, and figuring out if that person is the right person to be doing it. There was a really interesting Twitter engagement over the summer where there was an article released saying that university presidents don't prioritize student affairs. And I found that really fascinating, because there was a very big backlash of, of course, student affairs is so important and really, really, really key to the student experience. And of course it is, but the priority of an academic institution is the academic mission. So I was surprised a little bit by that. But the other piece was, is it more the fault of our decision makers that they don't value us, or is it our fault for not telling them the story that they need to hear to understand our value? And so I think we need to think really hard about, especially when you have one person you're trying to influence with a story, understand more about how that person thinks, what they need to hear, and who they need to hear it from to be able to influence them. And this is, again, where the storyteller becomes very, very important. Storytellers aren't neutral. They add their own context to the story. So hearing a story from me as a staff member is going to be different than hearing a story of students from a student. Or especially when we're considering equity-seeking groups, hearing a story that's from the mouth of somebody who is living that experience, as opposed to somebody who is talking about it, having researched it or something like that. So we need to be very, very careful and ethical about who we center in stories, because it will change the narrative and it will change how the culture shifts. So the issue here too is that if we don't provide that context, the number of times I've heard people say data speaks for itself. It doesn't speak for itself. And if you put it out there without any context, people will provide their own. And it might not be the one that you want. Because again, as soon as you pass that data to somebody else, it immediately becomes contextualized by their lived experience. So you need to understand that and craft enough context around it so that they actually hear the truth that you're trying to share with them. Otherwise, it can become their own truth. I'm going to show you a little example of that with a little bit of an activity here. So we'll move to the next slide, and you can take a look at some photos. We're going to share them really slowly. I want you to take a look at those photos and think about how they make you feel. Think about things that are maybe in your life that make you feel those things. Now, a lot of the times, I can't really get any back and forth on this, but a lot of the times when I show this slide, I hear things like, they feel melancholy, or I see the snowman, and I can remember building a snowman with people in my youth, or it feels like there's somebody missing from that group shot. It's like somebody's been cut out of the photo, so maybe somebody was angry, maybe. Some people find the photo in the hospital as very emotional, especially if you have a personal lived experience connected to hospital settings. And then there's the young gentleman with the guitar. And a lot of people say he looks very intense. He looks sad almost. And a lot of the emotions that come out are contextualized by how the photos are positioned on the same slide. What is it that connects them? One person came up with a story that maybe it was about, they came up with a whole story and a narrative about how the pictures came out and what that meant to them. I'm going to share with you the actual context and why I put these photos on a slide together. So I'm going to get Marilee to share that. It's from a Vice Canada campaign in 2015, and these were all photos that were too hard for people to keep. So they asked for people to send them photographs that were too hard for them to hold on to, but that were very important to them. And now look at those photos again. And I think you'll see that they have a different emotional impact. They tell a different story now because of the context that I provided. So this is just one example of how important it is for you to make sure that you've given enough context to stories that you're trying to share and data that you're trying to put out, because otherwise people will make it their own. And sometimes that's a good thing. You can use that as a storytelling tool, actually, just like I've done here. But other times it won't impact the way that you want it to. So I think we're going to jump in and talk a little bit about the assessment cycle, which is what got me thinking about design thinking way back in the day. So this is a pretty standard assessment cycle. This was the one that I used while I was at Ryerson. Starts out with developing our departmental goals, identifying our learning outcomes, and then I liked the language here, connect with program services and learning opportunities, because in best case scenarios, we're trying to create our learning opportunities based on our outcomes, but sometimes we're trying to develop outcomes after we already have programs that are running. So it's really important to make sure that you do that connecting though. And then once we've connected those things, we can gather our data while we're implementing those programs. And then we review and interpret our assessment results, use those to inform our decisions in practice, and then that will feed the future development of goals for departments and divisions. Now, the most often I see people fall down at review and interpret the assessment results, and definitely at inform decisions and practices, and then develop departmental goals. Usually we fall off the wagon after gathering data. That's why I've heard of the data pledge that, we pledge not to keep data getting dusty in our drawer. And I think that's really, really important, because we enter into a covenant of trust with our students when they provide us with data that we will use it, to make their experience better, and that we will use it to make us better. So if we fall off the wagon after gathering data, we're failing them. We're damaging their ability to trust us. And one of the best ways to increase your survey results, your survey response rates, is to tell students how you used the last set of data and what changes were made because of it. And if you do that, you'll see all of a sudden a lot more buy-in from students who want to participate and give you that information because they know you'll use it. So I was wondering and asking a lot of questions about why we were falling off the wagon where we were, and what was so hard for us about figuring out how to close the loop. And that's what got me thinking about design thinking and how I connected with Julia.
Great. So I think we're going to take a look at one model of design thinking. This is the Stanford D-School model. There are a number of different models out there and different kind of thought leaders when you use the word sort of design thinking. But I'm just going to kind of quickly run through the D-School model for those that aren't too familiar. So the first phase is empathize. And this is where empathy is gained by collecting data through interviewing, so open-ended, empathy-based interviews, observations, and often other creative ways that folks find to kind of immerse themselves in a population of users and their experience. So in our case, this would be students, but there's stories of at IDEO where, for example, they were looking at the case of an emergency room experience, and they had an employee or an IDEO designer went through the emergency room experience, and the key insight was that he spent a lot of time staring at the ceiling because he was lying on one of those sort of beds the whole time. So that's really trying to build empathy through different methods is the empathize phase. And then there's the define phase, and this is where you sort of look for interesting insights in the data that you've gathered during the first phase. And sometimes you can identify that there's a problem and create a problem statement as well. But these insights and problems, well-defined problems, are really important for the next stage because it really serves as inspiration. Ideation is where high volume of ideas are generated. Certainly wild and crazy ideas are encouraged. And outside the box thinking is really important as well. And then the prototyping and testing phases are kind of iterative and they go together. Because it's really about creating some kind of physical representation of the idea in order that you can sort of present it back to the users or the students in our case, see what they think of it, observe how they interact with it, and then, which is really the testing, and then kind of iterate based on that, make modifications, and see what happens. It's important to note, though, prototyping isn't just for a physical product, that services could be prototyped. So there's different creative ways to do that, but role playing or storyboarding a role play is one example of that. So this is where we kind of refine solutions, and continuously, I think what's important here is that you continuously come back to those insights, those problems, that data that was gathered from the students to be able to see if the solutions are really meeting the needs. So Leslie has done something very creative with this model, so I'm excited to see her share it.
Thanks, Julia. It's really funny, actually. Julia and I had connected earlier, and Julia is doing this all in practice, and I hadn't actually gotten into practicing a lot of the model when we had started speaking, but more thinking conceptually about how we could work through this process. So I took a lot of the elements of the design thinking model and then tried to Frankenstein it together with the assessment cycle. And I added in a new step. So the big issue that I found with the assessment cycle, and the reason that there was a bit of a barrier to us closing the loop, is because I think that empathy wasn't named anywhere in it. We didn't actually understand that assessment is the #1 most empathetic thing that we can do as student affairs professionals. And if we're going to call ourselves student-centered, then we have to be invested in assessment, because otherwise we are telling our own story and not the story of our students. So I love that we start with empathy, and there is one entry point into this cycle, and it has to be empathy. Listening, focus groups, using data and ethnography to understand the experience of our end user, who is our students. And then using that information to define our goals and outcomes. And like Julia said, we can't go to solutions. You cannot go to solutions until you get to the ideate stage. So in defining goals and outcomes, it's really about understanding the needs of the end users and crafting that into an insight and a bit of an issue or a needs motivation that you can use to create a solution. So then that feeds the ideation stage, which most of the time when we talk about brainstorming, I think that we're kind of doing it wrong because we edit ourselves. And I think of ideate as a way to capture divergent thinking to converge on the right solution. So we have to make sure that we're using the most radically different and radical solutions to the problem that we can think of, because you can think of those like the base of branches on a tree. You're not going to get to the little twigs on the edge of the branches unless you think of those deep base ideas at the start. So you have to not edit yourselves. Don't think about what your leaders are going to accept. Don't think about how much things cost. Just start ideating and coming up with potential solutions, because something magical happens about 20 or 25 minutes into an ideation session. And that's when all the great ideas start happening. They're never the ones you start with at the very beginning. So you have to follow those down the rabbit hole a little bit to figure out where they're going to go. I changed the prototype stage. I changed the language to pilot. And this was just because I understood in my culture where I was that prototype sounded like you were designing a retail product. When I said pilot, all of a sudden I was speaking the same language. So it's understanding and listening to that culture and using their language to help them understand exactly what you're going for. So I think when I start to talk about pilots, people understand what I mean in the context of student affairs and services. So we pilot something. The key here, though, is that we have to gain that feedback from our end users again. This is another point for assessment. You have to make sure that you're giving some kind of representation of what you're creating to your end users for them to comment on. So that they can give you that feedback. And then you implement, assess, and interpret all of your results. And that's the spinning cycle of the assessment cycle that we were missing. And I think that what helps us close the loop is storytelling. If we can understand that we're going to share the story of what we did, and that's actually built into the cycle, then that's going to help us close the loop. Because the other thing is that when you end with storytelling, you can be both listening to and telling stories. And that's going to feed your next stage of empathy. So this can be an ongoing system, an ongoing cycle for students and for staff to be designing the best solutions for the culture that you are in. So I think that the key to this is that we acknowledge there are no solutions that are blanket good for everybody across the board. We have to understand the culture that we're in, and we have to listen to those stories to be able to empathize with them, and then tell our own story at the end if we want to influence change in that culture. So that's design assessment thinking. And I know we really wanted to talk about data storytelling and exactly what that looks like. So this was one of the best visualizations I found to understand the different elements of storytelling. And it's from this great Forbes article. If you want to Google it, you can. And it's called Data Storytelling, the Essential Data Science Skill Everyone Needs. And it's from last year. And I loved how they combined these three different elements in different ways, because I can think of examples of each of them that help me engage. So when we combine narrative and data, that serves to explain information. So that's every good report that you've ever seen that that gives you the context and the characters and the setting and tells a little bit of a story around the data. When you look at the visuals combined with data, that serves to enlighten. And that's every chart you've ever seen. That's every data visualization that tells, that serves to highlight the important parts of the data without you having to go through raw data and visualize it for yourself. So the key here, and the one that I'm going to harp on a little bit, is that there are a lot of visualizations out there that require a lot of work for people to look at to understand what they mean. And I think that if you have to do too much work to understand what the visualization is trying to tell you, then it's a bad visualization. We should be having visualizations that can immediately and effectively enlighten people. So if bar charts are what everybody understands, use bar charts if they make sense, because that's going to be something that people can understand easily. So I know that there's a whole suite of amazing new visualization tools and options out there. Just make sure we're considering whether or not they're doing the job they're supposed to do. Are they quickly enlightening people? And then this last one, when you combine narrative and visuals, that serves to engage. And that's everything on Netflix, because it's not data informed, probably, although you can have some really good data informed documentaries on there. But when you have narrative and visuals combined, it gets really addictive because it's plugging directly into our limbic system so that we can really feel what the characters in the show are feeling. And it's there visually for us, so it's very fast, and we're fast able to connect with those characters. The amazing thing is that when you can explain, enlighten, and engage all at the same time, then we settle in on this last slide, which is we combine them, and that's where you can find change happening. So you can see when you have narrative and visuals and data together, that might be an amazing infographic that has a narrative to it. That might be an amazing Netflix documentary. Or it can be some of these other examples that Julie is going to talk about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is great. So just going back to that last slide there, the one, I think Les explained it perfectly. The one thing I just wanted to add was, I mean, obviously we're all accustomed to having lots of reports, lots of charts and things like that. So I think what our work was able to do in this past year, what we saw was that when you add a human element to things, you really get a compelling story. So for example, like oftentimes we would have a data point, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but oftentimes you would have a data point where it would be concerning, but you wouldn't really understand the human story. So let me get, and then the other thing I want to say about visuals, just quickly going back to the last topic, was pictures. So we often think about charts and things like that as explaining data, but what we also found is pictures and photos of students, and particularly in design, we look for ways in which people are modifying your world. So it's interesting just to sometimes go for a walk around campus and see the quirky, unique things that students do, and take some photos. but just really start to think about what do those photos mean, right? Or why would this person be modifying their world in that way? And so that gives us really interesting insights into the design process. So we'll move on to the next slide. I just have a few quick examples from our work that I wanted to share. So we have the, let me make sure I get this right, the NESI survey, which is, Leslie, correct me if I'm wrong, National Student Services Engagement Survey. Is that the correct? We always call it NESI.
Yeah, I think everybody calls it NESI.
Yeah, National Survey of Engagement.
National Survey of Student Engagement, thank you so much. So of course it's a very important survey, and there is a stat in there a couple of years ago when we launched the Innovation Hub around students that reported that they never found community while they came to University of Toronto. And it wasn't a huge number, but the fact that there was any number was concerning, and so we really wanted to understand this a little bit better. And what ended up happening is that as we started talking to students, it was just, it came so clear in their stories that we did have challenges with students being able to build community in such a large decentralized institution. It was this theme of like, where's my pond, right? And, you know, how do I make a small pond out of this big, huge, overwhelming place? And so I just wanted to share a few quotes just to kind of show you the power of that. So when we have a percentage of students, it's one thing, but when you read this first-year undergraduate student who's a refugee and a commuter student who said, I spend a lot of time on the bus coming and going home. It takes me 1 to 2 hours a day. I feel like I miss a lot of events on campus because I have to go home. Maybe if I had a chance to go, I would have made more friends. There's another one here. Next slide. This student is a fourth-year undergraduate in arts and science who said, I'm only here about 2 to 4 hours a day, so I didn't really feel connected to anyone I would see in class because I didn't really see them very frequently, and they either lived closer in residence, then it was too late. So here you see the actual, I mean, you can really just pause for a moment and feel the empathy for that student who's in their fourth year, who's saying it's too late, right? This is a true story of a student that may have said, yeah, I never really did find a sense of community there. I have one more quote and then a just quick anecdotal story to share as well. Another fourth-year student who said, not having connections does increase my level of stress. You can't always find support. The focus on academics leaves little time for people to make meaningful connections. And just before we move on, you know, I mean, this speaks to also another theme that we found as well, which was because we are in such a large decentralized institution, the wayfinding and navigation here is a real challenge for students, and it does impact the sense of community that they feel. There was a story that I heard recently, and it was where a staff member was walking through campus this summer, and they sat down on a bench, and a student happened to be sitting there, and they approached they just sat down and sort of said, hello, how are you doing today, to the student. And the student reacted in a really shocked way and said, oh my goodness, you're the first person that's spoken to me all week. I've been on campus all week, and you're the first person that's ever said hello. And that story was obviously so impactful and so concerning, but you can see just how some of the themes that emerge from the concerning stories, there's lots of great ones as well. Sometimes the sad ones are a little bit more impactful here, especially when we're trying to look into understanding a problem. But I think these are all powerful stories. So we'll go on to the next slide. And I just wanted to talk about personas a little bit. So beyond just quotes, what we started to do as part of our design process was we would capture the student experiences in the form of personas. So I'm going to share one today as an example of a student who had an extremely challenging time at the university for many reasons that you'll hear about, and that's Alex. But before I talk about Alex, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the things that we thought deeply about in persona work. So throughout our project, we had a chance to work closely with our colleagues at the Raman School of Management in the Martin Prosperity Institute that do a lot of work in design thinking and persona work. And they let us know that really the current persona practice is to take one student's story and create a persona out of it. But we struggled a little bit with this because we really wanted to make sure that we could de-identify the information enough to protect the student. And so we took a slightly different approach with persona work in that some of our personas do combine elements of different stories that we've heard. And then the other thing is kind of the debate, and I wouldn't probably share this persona in this way again, but it's really around what visuals do you use with personas. And as we started using characters or visuals of a human face or a human image, we realized that there were some issues around that, and that might be a trigger for some people or might sort of create a bias, and that there might be equity issues around that. So moving forward, we've actually, this was a persona we shared last year in this way, but we've actually chosen to use symbols or sort of images of representative objects rather than human faces. And before I share Alex's story, I also just want to mention that this was one of many personas that we worked with, so we did have a very diverse set of student experiences, but this is one that was deeply impactful for a lot of the people that heard it. So I'm just going to read Alex's story to you. So this is, we called this student Afraid Alex, just one of the students that we interviewed, and their experiences reflect those of some other students that we spoke with last November. Alex is a trans student who found community through being an active participant in a social justice club on campus. But after a year or so, the club's leadership changed, and the group started to have some alt-right values and created a really uncomfortable situation for Alex. They hear about threats of physical violence being made toward them due to their identity, and subsequently left the club, losing the community they thought they'd found here at U of T. They attempt to reach out to staff with regards to the hate speech that was occurring on the club's Facebook page. However, ultimately, Alex is told that in order to move forward with the complaint, there needed to be compiled evidence or something couldn't be done. Alex found this too time-consuming and emotionally draining, so gave up. Stress began to pile up, and one day Alex encountered the club at an event they were attending. This caused them to have a panic attack and made them feel less safe about being on campus. They remember the difficulty they'd faced in trying to change their name earlier that year and trying to explain the protocol to those in charge. They're afraid, and in a climate they feel is transphobic. Alex is registered with Accessibility Service, so given their mounting stress, they ask for an extension on a paper. However, their professor denies the extension, and so Alex has to reach out to the registrar in order to push it through. The process is long, and the professor takes several months to mark their 1,500-word essay. In the meantime, the course is not counted towards Alex's total course load, and they lose financial assistance. Alex is an international student, so they return home to the summer, unsure whether they'll be able to come back in the fall. They spend the summer making the calls to their department in various offices, but due to the season, the process moves at a snail's pace. Luckily, Alex is able to register for the fall session thanks to the money they save up. However, as of the conversation last fall, well, they had finally finished the administrative procedures, the financial assistance was still in the process of renewal. So Alex is clearly quite frustrated and disheartened by the interactions they've had on campus with faculty and staff and fellow students, and it made them feel alone and unsafe when they walk around campus. So obviously this is an extreme story. I wouldn't say that it's representative of all the stories we heard, but it did evoke a great deal of emotion and concern from our administrative staff when we started to share Alex's story. And given the decentralized nature, as I mentioned, of our institution, which is home to over 80,000 students, sometimes we as staff, we forget to consider the impact of a single interaction and how it can impact the students' overall experience. So Alex's story, I think, really reflects what happens when you combine these circumstances and see the overall impact that they have. It's really, I think, it's impossible to hear Alex's story and not feel a great deal of empathy for them. This is really the power of a persona. The students, on the other hand, felt, as we went through this process, they started to really feel heard more than ever before. And so many of the students that we spoke to told us, you're the first person that's ever really demonstrated that you deeply care about my experience here. And obviously it's concerning, but it's also an indication for us that we're on the right track in terms of the work that we're doing and continuing to listen to and hear the stories of our students. And part of, as Leslie mentioned, it's so important to have that change, but part of what we're trying to do with those stories is make sure that they're getting heard by people in all of the right areas so that people can realize that sometimes our administrative procedures do have an impact on the overall student experience. So that's it.
Julia, can I interject with a question really quickly? So there's a question from Sandy about are the personas that you create, are they typically created using composites of a number of students? And if so, how many students do you usually use to create a persona, one persona?
Yeah, we don't have a hard and fast rule. I mean, as I mentioned, Brotman really believes like the current practice is to use one story. So there's no kind of rules that we adhere to. It's more around how can we try to capture the story in an authentic way while also de-identifying and protecting the student identity. So what might happen is elements of different stories come into to the different personas, but we try to make sure that the crux of the story remains the same. So there aren't a set of hard and fast rules, and I think we're still trying to figure out what works best in our context. But and I do think we probably have some personas that were, you know, general enough that were based on one story, but I think it's varied as we kind of work through this process.
Okay.
I think just to share a different way, I did, before I left Ryerson, create one persona based on doing some qualitative coding on a number of stories that had been submitted as part of an assessment process. So we asked for people to do a bit of an autoethnography, and when they submitted the stories, I went through and did some thematic analysis, and then I took the themes and I wrote basically a monologue around those themes that captured those themes. So I think, and this is sometimes I think where we run into challenges, that we think that in order to ethically share data that we can't tell one person's story because it doesn't apply to everyone. And the problem with that is that objectivity may be the data analyst's friend, but subjectivity is the storyteller's friend. So we have to be okay telling one person's story, and it's ethical as long as we know that that story and the patterns and the themes that are coming out of that story are informed by data that we're seeing from other students. So you can say that we have this data set, or we've captured these themes, or we know this exists as an issue on campus. Here's one student's story that relates to that issue.
Mm-hmm. And so you also touched on the ethical piece and really just the sensitivity around the data sharing, particularly with persona building. So there was a question from the audience about how might small institutions use the persona approach. So in terms of a number of enrollment of around 1,500 or less, since I think an extra layer of sensitivity needs to be in place regarding identifying students and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me in that case, I would probably be tempted to combine more stories. I mean, there's simple things like changing genders or changing characteristics of the student's story that can easily de-identify that student, but still get the same point across. We're very, very careful with our data. So there's a very small handful of people that have access to the data. We don't even save data until it's been de-identified, and we never save electronic copies of consent forms. We save them all in paper format. So we're really careful about that stuff. The other thing, I was going to say one other thing on this. I think also the quotes are really powerful too, and they can be de-identified easily as well. So if you're not comfortable going to the persona approach, I think quotes in some cases can be equally effective. And I did want to just say one more thing to make sure that this point is made, is that the way that we've used personas is there is a place for them in storytelling, but really what personas are in the design process is part of that sort of second define stage, right? So you want to, if you're working through a design cycle where you're using this data to inform program, service, resource redesign or design, then you want to be working with a number of personas that tell different student stories, because they're a really great way to check the ideas, right? So if you have, let's say, 6 personas that you're working with and they're a diverse group of students, then you can, as ideas emerge and you start testing them, you say, well, would this work for Alex? Would this work for Harjinder? Does this work for Jane, right? And so you have these kind of these sort of people that are sitting there in the design process that are inspired by students that you spoke to. So you're kind of keeping the stories front and center in that design process, and that's really how they're intended to be used. Although they are really great storytelling tools as well. Like Leslie said at the beginning, you know, if we're collecting this data, then we need to make sure that where there's problems, we're working to try to solve those problems and create a better student experience.
I think I see another question there from Stan.
Yes, it looks like about compensating for the personas and their ability or lack of really to generalize with qualitative data.
And I think that my response to that would be, how do we compensate for quantitative data's propensity to erase the stories of marginalized and equity-seeking people? I think that you have to look at weighing what different data is good at in different ways and create a very wide contextualized story. No data is perfect. And I know that we say that it's generalizable, and yes, that's true from a statistical standpoint, but then we run the risk of erasing individual stories like Alex, who have lived this and it's true. I think we use the word anecdotal like it's a bad word and that it means that it's untrue, but that is true for one person. And so for me, creating a persona that is a student, that is based on a composite of stories or otherwise de-identified from the culture that I'm working in, that's a true story of this culture, and that's happened. So if it's happened to them, then chances are there are elements of the story that need to be addressed in one way or another. And I think we need to not be so afraid of taking things and saying that they have to be generalizable in order to be useful. But at the same time, I agree, we have to make sure that we're balancing that and creating a bit of a mixed methods story. I think that this is a case for mixed methods, to make sure that we're balancing different ways of knowing, and not shutting the doors on individuals or shutting the door on understanding patterns that are happening on our campuses.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in a couple things. I mean, when we started this process, keep in mind that we did start with kind of the quantitative data. So there were some data points that we zeroed in that we were like, you know, we know that we need to understand these numbers more. So we did kind of have that there. There's a concept in design thinking around extremes. And so you can imagine that with interviews lasting from 45 to 90 minutes, we can't possibly do that with every student. And so, you know, and there's going to be bias in every process. But one of the things that we did at the beginning of the process was we sort of crowdsourced data, and we defined domains of innovation that gave a little bit of scope to the work. And then this persona came out of the domain which we called access for every student. So it was really around looking at how students access services that are available to them on campus, or where there's barriers around that, and understanding why. But when that group started to think about who they wanted to interview, they thought about, okay, let's think about the spectrum of students. And, you know, if you've got this bell curve where your sort of quote unquote average student is in the middle, we looked for extremes. So we wanted to say, okay, what are those, where are the margins, and how do we find students that are kind of in those sort of extreme categories, whatever that may be. And obviously those were intense discussions, and there was a lot of factors to consider, but that's one of the concepts that's often used in design to be able to sort of find those stories that often get erased, like Leslie was saying.
Yeah, there's actually an excellent comment from the live chat as well around statistics are so often taken as truth, but putting a persona in a situation, exploring how it might work for them or not is really powerful. I really agree. I never really thought about that, of using personas as ways to almost member check the decisions that you're making, and really thinking through your impact before you've actually, you know, made change or whatnot. So that's actually a really interesting concept.
Well, and a lot of my colleagues and myself included, I mean, I worked in career services before I was doing this role. And so I think when you're in a role where you're meeting with students every day, you just kind of start to think that you know students, right? Like I know students, I meet with them every day, right? This is what they need and they tell me these things. But I think something to consider too is that even for staff who are meeting with students regularly, there are students that aren't accessing those services. And so when we use our own sort of knowledge of just from the students that come to see us, that's inherently biased because it's, you know, there are students that aren't accessing those services too, right? So.
Mm-hmm. I have one logistical question before we move on. And I'm surprised no one's asked this, but really, like, what is the time to actually do some of this work? I mean, for me, the whole notion of creating personas, I mean, you know, I'm a shop of one myself. Like, I'm getting overwhelmed thinking about it. It sounds so cool. And what a great impact this kind of work has. But I'm just kind of curious, like, so are there multiple people engaging in this process, or is it just one person?
Yeah, I mean, so I will say, I mean, I'm fortunate in that I'm in the dedicated role to lead this project and to do this work, but I am a shop of one as well. So what I basically did was I created a structure where students and staff can get involved in this project. So we had last year when we were doing these interviews, some of them were student, like part-time work study, student staff roles. This is sort of more leadership roles, but we had, I think there was over 150 at the sort of maximum point of students and staff working together on this. So we were able to kind of train them in the methodology and then just kind of create this scaled approach. But again, to say that, you know, we were fortunate in that the institution really wanted to invest in really better understanding who our students are, how the world's changing for them, and what that means for the future of, you know, the way that we offer student services here at U of T. But it's a challenge, I will say. But I also kind of think for the staff that were involved, sort of as a project opportunity off the side of their desk, it was really, really insightful for them because it really, being able to sit down with students, interview them, do the observations, go through the persona creation process. A, they learned about design thinking, but B, they really had a lot of their assumptions challenged. So it's been part of the sort of culture change strategy to get as many folks involved in the work as we possibly can as well.
Thank you.
All right.
Do you want to tackle this one? What was the design thinking adoption process like on your campus? Leslie, do you want to go first?
Sure.
Over to you.
And I think this comes directly back to cultural readiness, where you think your culture is at in terms of being ready to adopt a new way of thinking or a new way of doing things. It felt very natural and easy conceptually when we could start explaining the concept of what we were doing and helping people understand that. And actually, as someone leading division assessment, it was helpful to be able to frame assessment through empathy, because I think there were a lot of people who were looking at assessment thinking, oh my gosh, it takes away my ability to be intuitive. It takes away my ability to, be empathetic to individuals because I'm going to have to account for everything in data. And when I started saying, story is a type of data, like we can use, like qualitative data is a real way of knowing, and we can use different ways of knowing to help build our empathy, and in conjunction with a lot of the quantitative data we already had access to. And here's how we can be able to move forward and build really good things for our culture, and it's gonna fit here even better because we're doing it this way. I think again, you just have to do that upfront work to explain how it's going to fit into what's already being done, and not necessarily replace or erase things that are key parts of the culture. So it's really, you really have to start with listening to what's important to people and helping them frame what's important to them within the structure of what you want to introduce.
Yeah, and I would just say it's been really challenging, right? Because it's a new way of doing things. And maybe I'll answer this question with just a few tidbits of learning that I've had rather than kind of going through the process was. I mean, I think it's hard. I think there's been a lot of people that don't really understand why we're doing this, or it's taken getting to the point where we actually have those stories and there's personas for the people that said, I don't know why we're doing this, to start to say, oh, okay, this is really interesting, or yeah, I can really understand why this work is valuable, right? So I think sometimes it's a proof is in the pudding kind of scenario. But in hindsight, I think, one of the things that it would be super easy to do on a lot of campuses is almost all of our units within Division of Student Life here have some kind of advisory board, focus group, etc. I think those are a great place to start. For example, I've often heard my colleagues I'm not an assessment expert, but I've often heard, folks who are in assessment comment on, sometimes there's bias in those types of groups just inherently by the type of student that would come out and participate in something like that, or who has the luxury of time to be able to volunteer their time in that way. So, even rethinking, is a focus group or an advisory board of students appropriate, or could we get answers to the same questions that we have by interviewing maybe a group, maybe doing 10 interviews with students who represent kind of very different situations, right? And use the empathy-based interviewing technique to start to get some quantitative data that way and see about what stories those tell and what insights we get, rather than kind of having a prescribed list of questions and in a room setting where oftentimes the most powerful voices get the most airtime, et cetera. So even just changing the approach to that, I think, is one small, easy way that you could start to think about adopting this kind of methodology on your campus. I think there's little ways you can start with different things, but that's one thing I've encouraged folks to do, is think twice about where you need a focus group or an advisory board and where you just need some quantitative data from different types of students around the types of services that you're offering, and get some new insights that will help you design your programs.
Great, thank you. I think we have another question.
How has storytelling impacted your campus? As you can tell from Alex's story, there's a lot of people that are pretty upset by it, right? It's hard to hear the hard stories. It's great to hear the great stories. And U of T is a world-renowned research institution, right? There's tons of great media articles about, the amazing research that's going on here. And it's funny because from students' perspective, all of those stories just make each student feel like they have imposter syndrome, like they can't possibly measure up to what's going on here, right? And so I think it's really just brought the student perspective to the forefront a little bit more, and it's having a powerful impact. It's slow, but it is having a very powerful impact.
Yeah, I think it's funny because how has storytelling impacted your campus? I've been on UOIT's campus now this is day 7. So I don't have many stories to tell here yet. I'm still doing lots of listening. But in terms of working at Ryerson, I can see the power of storytelling in all of the work that's being done in the Division of Student Affairs there. It started with an internal blog that we created to basically break down some barriers and silos and start to spotlight different staff from different areas and build relationships and provide a little bit of a space for people to be sharing stories about their work so we could start to build a common understanding. And it quickly gained attention from lots of people within the institution, but outside student affairs. So we suddenly had new allies in different faculties and different parts of the administration. We had new allies outside of the institution, which was really exciting. And so we started to try and figure out ways to tell broader stories that would be impactful outside of the institution. And I think that being able to gain the resources that we had a team of storytellers, and that was achieved basically because we saw the power and the impact and the increase in resources. We actually saw an increase in funding significantly because of stories we were able to publicly share about the impact and the power of our work. So I can't talk enough about how important it is and how key it will be, especially as we enter into more resource scarce years for higher education.
Great. So if we move on, I have a question for our audience is how might you use storytelling on your campus? If you have a question while we're waiting on any sort of comments on how people might use storytelling on their campuses, about what media do you share stories through? Video, print, in person? How do you go about sharing these?
Well, after our first year in the Innovation Hub, we did prepare a report. It kind of gave quotes, it gave insights, and shared some personas from from each of those domains of innovation. But I will say, we don't share that publicly. Like, we have a blog, and we'll sometimes share blog posts around themes, but I wouldn't put a persona on the blog, for example, because it's kind of for internal use.
Mm-hmm.
So we share it with, internal people that are involved in the project, or people can request it, but we haven't put it out there completely publicly yet. So I haven't gotten into using any. We've had like video interviews and stuff like that, but again, it's around how do you protect people's identities and really anonymize it. So I mean, internal presentations, these sorts of things, like conference presentations and stuff like that, with people sort of working in the field, so you assume the ethics piece there, but we haven't put it out broadly, just publicly.
In terms of sharing stories, I think that we often forget that we also have to apply outcomes thinking to stories. It's the same way that we do to our programs. So you can't just say, okay, we're going to have a video, we're going to have print, I need posters for this. You need to sit and think about, from an outcome standpoint, who is the audience for this that I'm trying to reach? Where do they currently look for information? In what ways do I need to frame the information for them to get it to them most effectively, and not necessarily most efficiently? If you want to make actual cultural shift and cultural change in a large space, you need to figure out who the influencers are. Sometimes it's making sure the story gets to specific people. Sometimes it's making sure it gets to a whole group of people, or both. I think that we fall back on thinking that we need a lot of things that we don't necessarily need as much of. We print posters for everything. Posters are good for reinforcement. They are not good as a primary tool to get information out. It is a good reminder to have around campus, but then you have to do a cost benefits analysis and understand, can I afford that reminder, because they're quite costly. Social media is a great tool and a very powerful tool, but the platforms are all different, and different stories. The same story has to go out differently on different platforms, because you need to understand how your students are on there using them in different ways. And there is no baseline. There's no like everybody's on Snapchat, everybody's on Instagram. It's different. It's different depending on different campuses. It depends on where those students have built their communities online, who are then in bulk coming to the campuses. Social media community is really about critical mass. So it matters which ones most people are on, because that's the ones that more people will gravitate towards. So you need to understand that and do a little bit of an environmental scan of your campus to understand where those stories are, or where they need to go. And if you don't need to make a video, don't make a video. I think we always think we need a video. It's a huge cost to be done well. And if it's done poorly, it's almost useless. In some cases worse than useless. So I think we need to put a lot of thought into what methods we're going to use to get things out effectively and within our resource landscape.
Great. So there have been a lot of really great comments coming in the live chat around how people use storytelling. We're talking about working on a comparative GPA and persistence among majors, teams, campuses, and housing arrangements. A narrative approach will breathe life into the effort. Joe also mentioned using it in academic program review, and contextualizing the data across student affairs areas, portraying the student journey through their experiences in the university, and also in connection to careers. We have one final question, and then we'll need to wrap up for the day. It looks like it came from Bill, around, from a managing change perspective, what are the more difficult moments of One, implementing design thinking and using stories to influence decisions.
I want to answer this question with yes. There are many. I don't know. I mean, it's hard. It's hard work, right? We work in a complex space with complex people, right? I mean, both on the staff and faculty side and on the student side. So I think what I would just say is the most important thing is just to try to capture people's hearts, right? And it's like the hearts and minds thing, right? Is give people something that they can relate to. And so I think through using examples like personas or through actually showing people. And for me, I always go back to this is about designing with students and not for them, right? And that's kind of, and in those difficult moments, that's kind of my mantra, is like, go back to the students, right? And so I'm fortunate that I get to work with a lot of students. But I mean, we all work in very political environments where there's complex, governance structures, et cetera. So I think, I don't want to list off all of those moments because there are many, but just, just remembering why we do the work that we do, right? That we are trying to create a better experience for our students. And that to me is a worthwhile cause that gets me up and helps me commute every morning to downtown Toronto.
I can't agree more. I think that we have the benefit of working in student affairs and higher education. We have the benefit of tapping into a culture that is already very bought into a belief that the work that we're doing is important. And that's super powerful. So design thinking to me speaks directly to that. It wasn't hard for me to convince people that design thinking was a good way to do the work because it's framed around empathy, which is what a lot of people believe in when they get into this work. What I did see as challenging in some ways was getting people away from being afraid that we were going to generalize the wrong things around individual stories and building confidence. Getting people to feel more confident about being able to engage in a process and listen to stories and be able to make good meaning out of that. But I think that speaks again to just building capacity and skills and confidence in being able to do assessment. And understanding that design thinking and listening to stories and qualitative data as a form of assessment that we need to be doing. So yeah, I think there were, again, like Julia, lots of individual challenges and challenges that varied by department, depending on outcomes. But I think as long as you listen to what the core stories of that culture are, department-wide, division-wide, institution-wide, then you can start to understand what story you need to tell to either counter information or to massage it in the direction that you want it to go in. It's really, you just have to start with listening.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's now after 1 o'clock, so we'll need to go ahead and wrap up this afternoon. Let's see. If you have any final thoughts, comments, or questions, please feel free to chat them now. As we conclude today's session, let's thank our presenters, Leslie and Julia, and also thank you to Mary Lee and the SAL Professional Development Committee for their help in bringing today's conversation. A recording of our structured conversation and associated materials, along with the link to provide feedback, will be shared with you via email and will also be available on SAL's website. So thank you again for joining us and have an excellent afternoon. Bye-bye.